welcome to this Grattan Institute State Library of Victoria Victorian election special event. I am Danielle Wood, I'm Grattan Institute CEO. Welcome to all the people joining us online, and a special welcome to everyone in the room. We were just reflecting, we certainly don't run anywhere near as many in-person events as we did in the pre-COVID world, but it's always enjoyable when we do get to be here in this beautiful room and have our audience interact and put questions to the panel. I would of course like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as to any Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today. So, we are deep in Victorian election, 2.5 weeks to go. Promises are flowing thick and fast, and that is not just hyperbole. There is an extraordinary number and volume of promises, as I want to come back to. But alongside that has come, I think, some real policy differences between the major parties and between others as well. So, do you prefer your transport? Do you prefer your infrastructure spend on transport or health? Do we want to see the reformation of the state electricity company or $2 public transport fares? There is so much to unpack, and I cannot think of a better group to do it with than this fantastic panel. All of them have deep expertise in areas very relevant to state policy, and indeed many of the areas that have been really front and centre in this campaign. So if I can introduce my panel, we have Marion Terrell, Transport and Cities Program Director, Tony Wood, Grattan's Energy and Climate Program Director, Dr. Jordana Hunter, Grattan's Education Program Director, and last but not least, Brendan Coates, our Economic Policy Program Director. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to spend the next 35 minutes or so firing some questions at these guys. Then we are going to open up to questions in the room, so if you have any burning questions, have them ready to go. But before we get into the specific policy areas, I just wanted to make a few observations on the sort of broad economic and fiscal environment that we're going into the campaign. It's not a new thing to say, but I think it is true that we are in very unusual times economically. There are some real bright spots. Victorian economy has been strong, particularly labour market. We've got really historically low unemployment. Victoria has the lowest level of underemployment in the nation. And that means we just have a whole lot more people that are now in jobs that weren't in the pre-COVID world, and that's a wonderful outcome. On the other hand, inflation is public enemy number one, as the Treasurer likes to say. Prices are growing at more than 7% over the past year, and even though wages are now picking up, we know that in real terms they're expected to go backwards probably for another 2 years. So that means people are feeling the pain, real living standards are going backwards, and so unsurprisingly I think we've seen a bit of a focus on cost of living in this campaign, and we'll talk about some of the specific policies around energy and transport and housing. On top of that, the fiscal position is really challenging. Government debt coming out of COVID has hit about $100 billion. It's expected to continue to grow to close to $170 billion over the next 4 years. That will be about a quarter of the state's economic output. If we compare that to 2018, we were debating whether we should increase the debt ceiling from 6% of GSP. So that is a really big ramp up in debt in a short space of time. Obviously, a lot of that is to do with the fiscal response to the COVID pandemic, but there is also to do with a big expansion in infrastructure spending. So it's really struck me that with those two things in mind, the inflationary pressures and the fiscal pressures, there's been a bit of a disconnect, particularly with the scale of spending commitments that we've seen. I checked the Victorian PBO election tracker this morning. Coalition so far has committed $28 billion in new spending over the next 4 years, 244 commitments, and another 70 that they haven't announced funding for. Labor has committed $10 billion across 126 commitments. 2 of those they haven't announced funding for. And remembering also that Labor's made some pretty substantial commitments in terms of the early childhood and health space before the election, which are now baked into the fiscal numbers. So they are big. I think whoever forms government is going to have some pretty challenging economic and fiscal circumstances to grapple with, and that's really the backdrop for everything we'll be discussing. So on that very cheery note, let's do a deep dive now into some of these policy areas. For each of you, I'd love you to reflect in your area on what you think the major challenges are, and how do you think the policy offerings that we've seen so far, particularly from the major parties, set us up to respond to those challenges. Marion, I'm going to start with you, both because you're sitting next to me, but also because transport has been such a big feature of the campaign so far.
So thanks, Danny. And you said the word scale, and I think that's the right word when we're thinking about the transport infrastructure agenda. So there's already a very substantial agenda underway. The industry talks about it as a boom, and it's things like the Westgate Tunnel, the North East Link, the Metro Tunnel, level crossing removals. It's been an enormous agenda, and the government's is spending close to $20 billion a year on this. So it's happening in this environment, as Danny said, of very high debt. And the other thing that's relevant to this, of course, is the flood recovery. So we don't yet know what that's going to look like, but there's a very substantial infrastructure recovery requirement that will become apparent over the coming year. So then what are the biggest challenges for the next government? I think both parties have added substantial commitments to this infrastructure market. Labor goes into the election with its signature policy being the suburban rail loop. Now that's not an election promise this time around, it was last time around, but the scale of this project is just so huge. It's the biggest transport project ever promised in this country. And as well as that, Labor, when I looked yesterday at the election tracker, has promised a further $2 billion worth so far. The coalition has made this a differentiating point by saying it will scrap the suburban rail loop if elected. But before you think that's because they're concerned about the budget position, they've promised an alternative set of transport promises worth $15 billion so far. So scale, I think, is the biggest challenge. It's partly the budgetary position, but the other part of this is capacity constraints in the infrastructure construction sector, and just the scale of what's already underway in this state.
So Marion, I was talking about 2018, the time when the debt ceiling was lifted, and that the rationale at that point was actually about substantially boosting the infrastructure pipeline. How does what's on the table at this election that you just touched on compare to what we were talking about back in 2018?
The nature of the promises so far are quite different. There's a lot of money promised, but the nature of the promises at this point is vague. A couple of examples are the coalition says $10 billion to rebuild the state's road network, and 1.5 to bring Melbourne West's roads up to speed. So that kind of thing it's quite hard to know really what that involves. And whereas Labor's wanting $1 billion on cheaper public transport fares, more velocity trains, extra weekend services. So we've got a way to go before the election arises, but last time around we were getting more specific signature promises, but very different for the two major parties.
And we know that bipartisanship around major transport infrastructure projects has been something that's very hard to achieve in this state. How does that look in terms of the things being proposed?
I can't really detect much in the way of bipartisanship at this point. And I'd just like to make a comment about that, because you might think, well, it's an election, of course they're not going to be bipartisan, but in New South Wales it's quite a different story. When they had their election in 2019, of the $1 billion projects, the majority of them were, both parties agreed to them. So it can be done, and I think they do have if you have a more kind of orthodox process for generating project proposals and approving them, then perhaps that is a pathway to having sort of some substantial level agreement about what the state actually needs.
And what about the Greens here? We do tend to focus on the major parties for obvious reasons, but they've had a fair bit to say about transport. What do they put on the table?
They want $2.5 billion on a big bike build. And then apart from that, there's a lot of projects that don't have a dollar figure against them, which I'm fine with, but to increase the number of accessible tram stops and low-floor trams, upgrade accessibility of train stations, and also some more climate change-oriented things like to scrap the EV distance-based charge, to ban petrol car sales from 2030, and to have some affordability type schemes for people buying EVs.
Fantastic, thank you. Tony, energy I think has also featured pretty heavily in this campaign. It's probably a perennial in Australian election campaigns, and that's not going to go away for some time, I suspect. But what are the challenges here in Victoria, and how do you think what's been put on the table deals with those?
I think the first point about this is that a lot of things have changed since the last election. One thing, of course, is that the visible implications and consequences of a changing climate are here. We're seeing it all the time, and even the Federal Treasurer, or one of our Federal Treasurers, it turned out earlier this year, talked about how we've got this huge fiscal problem emerging of dealing with floods and droughts and fires. It's not going to go away, and some of what Marion was talking about relates to that. So it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but I think we are now into the point where, and this is what's happening in Egypt at the moment, you'd be aware of, that this is now becoming quite critical in terms of the decades we've got to actually make some action on this. And arguably, we've lost a lot of time. Now, you can blame anybody you like, but that's the fact of where we are. And so that means getting this right now is challenging. Interestingly, we've now also got a federal government who is engaged on this stuff. They've got a lot to catch up on. Not a huge policy outlook there, but some significant things. But what's also interesting, including for Victoria, is industry is now engaged in this question in a way that it hasn't before. And industry is putting pressure on governments to take action. So what it needs now, and this I think is the tricky one, is that it needs a whole of government approach to this, because there's no part of our economy that's not going to be affected by the changing climate or the response to the changing climate. And that means we do need to bring some of these things together, because it isn't just about electricity. I mean, Victoria, in Victoria, the highest by a long way compared to the other states of our emissions come from coal-fired power. We've started to get off that. How we do that is going to be really important, because no one's going to forgive a government if, as we do that, we have problems with reliability or problems with prices going up. So getting that balance right is probably one of the biggest challenges they've got. In addition to that, even though electricity is the biggest, there are also very significant emissions from transport, from agriculture, but also from industry. Now, we don't have some of the very big industry emissions that Queensland and Western Australia do, but we've certainly got some, and we have to get off gas. And how we get off gas, those of us who burn gas in our homes, let alone our businesses, is a really tricky political challenge, and I think that's going to be a hard one. And the other one, which is already running into trouble, if you virtually go anywhere in Western Victoria now, you will see signs against the companies who are trying to build transmission lines to connect the solar industry and the wind industry that we now need. Because we've done the easy bit. We've connected wind farms and solar farms where we have the transmission capacity. We've put solar on many, many roofs in this country, more than any other country in the world, proportionally. But we've done all that. The next bit starts to get hard, and that's where dealing with these issues around how do we work with communities and how do we get this stuff built is going to be really difficult. We have right now in Australia, and including in Victoria, an issue of energy poverty. Any of you who've got friends or relations in the UK have probably said to them, you can come out to Australia and you could pay for your holiday in Australia for the next 6 months based upon the savings you'd get from your energy bills in the UK. It's that bad there, but we have some really interesting challenges ahead in terms of energy prices. There's not a lot of difference between the two major parties, Danny, on this question. And that's an interesting development, because they're both, in some ways, even more so than the federal coalition. the Victorian coalition has signed up to some of the same targets the current Labor government has. And they would certainly, they're putting significant money, about $1 billion into building out the transmission system. They're also putting significant money into challenging some renewable energy targets that they've set, very similar to Labor. Probably the biggest single issue would be the one you mentioned, Danny, where the Labor government's announced that they would reincarnate. I'm not sure you bring it back from the dead, because the State Electricity Commission has been living all this time somewhere in the fabric of the government. But that's what they're going to do. What they actually do with it in terms of bringing back a government-owned entity to work in the energy space, I think is a big question. The coalition haven't had much to say about it, and some people in the industry have been quite negative about it. So I think that's probably the biggest area of difference, where the government has said, we will put significant dollars, the best part of $1 billion more dollars, into the government investing directly in renewable energy projects and storage projects. And that's probably one of the ones where there's a big difference between Labor and the coalition.
Yeah, that was certainly, for me, one of the moments of the campaign. I went, well, I sort of didn't see that coming. Now, I'm not going to let you get away with leaving it there, Tony. Is it a good idea?
Well, it's a trick, right? When everything that we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years to try and get our energy market fit for purpose has failed. No progress virtually whatsoever. This is a system that was initiated in Victoria very strongly in the very late 1990s, competition policy and privatisation. And arguably, for the first 10 years of its life, it delivered exactly what it was supposed to deliver. Lower prices, reliable and affordable electricity. And that worked. The challenge was that we created this market, and then we didn't bother to maintain it, we abused it, we misused it, and then we wondered why it wasn't working anymore. And the attempt so far to address that problem and get moving on renewable energy, closing down coal, having a carbon price that's failed several times. Australia's tried more of those than any other country in the world. That's all turned out to be making not the progress we need. And so, what governments have decided, that in the absence of, even though they contributed to the problem in many ways, they've decided they need to step in various ways to take more control of the system. And I think there is a need for more control, and there is right now a need for more planning, not because I'd prefer to start that way, because of where we are now, there is almost no choice, because if we don't, we are not going to make the transformation we need. And we're talking about an industrial revolution to a timetable if we're going to achieve what's required. So I think I can see why the government's done what they do. The question's going to be, are they really talking about creating the old SECV, which basically owned everything and operated everything, and people who lived through that, I didn't live in Victoria at the time, would say, oh my God, don't do that. But equally, what do they create? Do they create a small government-owned business that will compete with the private sector? That's not the rhetoric that came out of the Premier when he announced this. So there's very little detail, Danny, I think, on this. But I think so far it's probably going to play out reasonably politically quite well, because it sounds like a nice idea. Let's take back control. Let's get rid of those private, dirty, old coal-fired power stations. And remember, who built them? The government did. So, and it was mostly Labor government at the time who built some of this stuff. So, yeah, this is a very politically rhetorical issue. There's very little detail. I don't think you're going to see anything more before the election. In my view will be, the trick is, can they create something that can actually add to and create some real momentum for what's necessary, or does it become just a major distraction? I'd like to think it's the former, in which case it isn't a bad idea, not because fundamentally it's a good idea, but practically there's almost no choice except to take more control, and the only people who can do that right now, I think, because of what we got to, is the government. And I would not normally say that.
So let's take a more upbeat angle, perhaps. You and I were at the launch of Ross Garnaut's latest book a couple of weeks ago, and Ross for a long time has been talking about the opportunities that the transition brings, and the incredible endowments Australia has of renewable resources, some of the critical minerals that will be needed to build grids and solar panels, etc. What are the opportunities that you see in that space here in Victoria?
One of the interesting things about this transformation I'm talking about is that the jobs that are going to be affected in a negative sense, the industries that are going to disappear from the landscape of Australian economy, many of them are in regional Australia. Certainly places like Gladstone and Newcastle, but also in the Latrobe Valley. What's changed in the last little while, I think, is that people have recognised that once you've faced this and got past the denial stage, then you can start doing something about it. And what's happening, for example, right now in the Latrobe Valley, there are practical people on the ground. They've been there for the last several years working through with that community what needs to be done. And one of them is, for example, the potential for assembling, even manufacturing offshore wind farms. There's a lot of work in Australia which is really exciting, and the energy superpower concept that Ross Garner and we've written about as well is basically to say, look, Australian companies have been world leaders in digging stuff out of the ground and putting it in ships and sending it somewhere else. We have a significant share of the world's known resource in iron and bauxite, but also copper, nickel, alumina and manganese and cobalt and all those things, which are absolutely critical for an electrified world. Don't send them overseas as raw minerals. Add value to those, because we'll have the low-cost energy from our renewable resource in this country to add value to those resources. So it's not just, wouldn't it be nice to make stuff again? Economically, it might be very efficient to make stuff again and create long-term sustainable jobs. In Victoria, the opportunities aren't quite as great because we haven't got the same land mass as the Northern Territory, and we don't have some of the same resources, but we do have a fair share of these. The real challenge now is to mobilise that in a way that takes a very strategic look in which governments and industry work together. Because the scale and pace of what's required is way beyond what was going to, if we keep doing the way we're doing it now. Someone said the other day, the pace we're going now to deliver net zero by 2050, that's less than 30 years, at the pace we're going now, it would take 2,000 years. We don't have 2,000 years.
Right, we got back to the negative
That was
again.
a negative one, so the opportunity is
trying.
enormous.
Something that gets bandied around a lot when we talk about the opportunities is hydrogen. It seems very, very hot right now to have a hydrogen hub or a hydrogen facility. What is on the table in this election campaign, if anything, and what do you think of it?
Both sides of politics have made some commitments around hydrogen. I mentioned before the fact we need to, if we're going to reduce our emissions, we're going to have to stop burning gas in our homes and in our businesses. One way to replace that in some sectors is hydrogen. Now, I think for most of us in our homes and small businesses, it will be electrification, away from gas. But for many businesses, the electricity can't do what they need. It's either not a chemical feedstock, or it doesn't provide high enough heat for some some processing. And a lot of industrial processing needs that. So hydrogen is one way of doing that. Hydrogen may also be a fuel for heavy transport, where the cost of batteries and so forth, the weight of batteries may be prohibitive. Now, a lot of developments going on to those areas. Just about every city, every state, every government in Australia and half the ones around the world have got a hydrogen strategy, a hydrogen roadmap, a hydrogen task force, or a hydrogen document of some sort. Both sides of politics have made some commitments around hydrogen. The really interesting point now is, can any of them turn that into a credible policy framework to take us forward? Because I think hydrogen will have a role, but it's not yet clear exactly what that role will be, and I've not seen either side of politics really articulate, not just a grand vision, wouldn't it be nice to have hydrogen, but what exactly are we thinking the opportunity would be, and how we'd get there from where we are today, because I think hydrogen can play an important role. We are, by the way, recently we only had the first export of hydrogen from Australia in a ship to Japan. Much to the chagrin of the environmentalists and certainly the Greens, that hydrogen was made from brown coal and produced emissions in the process. So that was it's not even a trial. This is real stuff going on right now in the Latrobe Valley. But I think there is a real potential for hydrogen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, and it's going to require sustained investment to develop that opportunity.
All right, let's move on to talk about education. This is probably, I've seen a little less of this in the public debate, but obviously a crucially important issue for state governments, Geordie. So what do you see as the big challenges and we're talking about school education here, for school education system in Victoria, and what policies are there out there so far?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Look, it's a really interesting time in school education. Obviously, the last couple of years have been incredibly disruptive in schools around the country, but in particular in Victoria. And I think we're really seeing kind of that COVID lockdown hangover still in working its way through schools, through the profession, the teaching profession, and through many students still. But in some ways, you know, COVID and the pressures on schools, I think, really just drew attention to a number of underlying challenges that have been in the sector for many years. And if we have a look at the NAPLAN data, particularly the 2022 NAPLAN data, what we see is that those really persistent gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged children, they were wide before the pandemic, they're still wide now. And, you know, every election, my refrain is we need to be focusing on literacy and numeracy, and we need to be doing a better job to support disadvantaged students. Now, I think Victoria is an interesting case because if you compare the performance of Victoria in assessments like NAPLAN or even PISA, you know, Victoria comes across pretty well in a lot of ways. But when you account for the geographic distribution of schools, the underlying economic conditions in this state, some of the more nuanced analysis and some analysis that Grattan's done would suggest, in terms of that value add, the value add in Victoria is really about average compared to the rest of the country. So there's definitely room for improvement. And just to put some kind of context around what that gap, that learning gap looks like for advantaged and disadvantaged students, if you take where students are at in year 3, according to that NAPLAN data, if their parents went to university compared to if their parents didn't finish school, that gap is already a year or two in terms of achievement level in grade 3. But fast forward to year 9 and that gap has more than doubled. So in reading, that gap is around 4.5 years of learning between those two groups of students. And in numeracy, it's about 3.5 years of learning. So that's a tremendous gap. It's going in the wrong direction. At the very least, we want that gap to not get any wider, ideally to close, but it's actually getting wider over time. And when we compare the NAPLAN data to the PISA assessments, we see a fairly similar story. So about 40% of 15-year-old students in Victoria don't meet Australia's proficient benchmark in those PISA assessments. If you compare Victoria to the top performing PISA systems, we're well off the pace. And we also see that for our most advantaged students as well. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think, you know, while we need to sort of allow the trauma, I guess, of that COVID period to work through, we can't lose sight of the really pressing need, I think, to lift educational outcomes. In terms of, you know, what would turn it around, I think the evidence, the research literature is pretty clear. We do need this unrelenting focus on teaching expertise. We're blessed to have some incredibly high quality teachers in Victoria, but we need to make sure every single class has a high quality teacher every single day. And we know we do have problems with out of field teachers, you know, beginning teachers who don't have access to the curriculum materials and the professional development that they need to be confident when they step into the classroom. And there's certain schools around Victoria that are really struggling to fill some of those specialist teaching positions. So particularly in mathematics, there's a high number of out-of-field teachers in maths. We're seeing a large number of out-of-field teachers in design and technology, health and physical education, for example. So these are really pressing concerns. Policy-wise, you know, it's an interesting space. We haven't perhaps seen as much as we might have liked to have seen, particularly after the last couple of years. There's been a little bit more on the Liberal side and quite a broad range of policies, everything from school lunches to lifting literacy expectations and support in schools and curriculum review and materials development, which I might come to if I've got time. But, you know, one thing both parties agree on is that we need to build more schools and we need to refurbish the capital stock out there. And I think, you know, that's an area where both of them, I'd like to see some bipartisan commitment when they're building schools to remember to put the walls in the classrooms. Because we go and visit a lot of schools. It's great joy in my job. And this real commitment to flexible learning places, open plan learning, has got some really significant drawbacks. The acoustic noise is really significant. I mean, it sounds funny, but go into one of these new learning environments and sometimes you can't hear the classroom teacher speak because of the volume coming from the classroom across the open plan hallway. And, there has been a big push on inclusive education, but we have a number of students, obviously, with a range of sensory challenges, and they're really struggling in those open plan classrooms. So that's one I'd like to see some bipartisan commitment on. The curriculum materials, I think it is exciting to see, the Liberal Party put some policies out on that one. We have seen some investment under the current government in curriculum materials, but some Grattan research that we've recently published suggests we radically need to step that up. Lastly, what I will say is one of the broader kind of policy challenges in Victoria that I think has been, really distinguishes Victoria from most of the other jurisdictions. Historically, there's been a pretty strong bipartisan commitment for the last 30, 40 years to devolve a lot of autonomy down to the individual school level. So we've seen both sides of politics support that shift. And I think now there is a recognition that actually schools are not islands, particularly our smaller schools. They can't do that exceptional teaching work without more system level support, and we can't support inclusive education without much more departmental or for the Catholic system, head office support for schools. I think parties are still trying to work out what that means though. There's a lot of investment in the middle layer that needs to be rebuilt after decades of this shift towards devolution. And we're starting to see, I think, the Liberals may be acknowledging that a little bit more in some of their policy announcements around this election, and it'll be interesting to see where Labor takes that, should they be returned.
So on the curriculum materials, and you sort of explained it beautifully there. I mean, I was certainly shocked, Geordie, when you started to do work on this and told me that most teachers don't have access to sort of a common bank of high quality materials. And many people sort of that are well outside the system think, oh gosh, that's very strange. Why has it been so hard to get it implemented? And do you think that the opposition's policy will take us to where we need to go?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, the requirement to do whole school curriculum planning is actually part of the policy expectation currently. But our survey results showed that only 15% of teachers have access to comprehensive curriculum resources for all of the subjects that they teach, and about a third of teachers report not having access to any curriculum materials. I think we have radically underestimated in this country, including in Victoria, maybe particularly in Victoria, the complexity and the time requirement to develop whole school and high quality curriculum materials to implement the Victorian curriculum in the case of Victoria. We estimate it takes about 500 hours to pull together high quality curriculum materials for a single subject if you're starting from scratch. If you're teaching 4 subjects in secondary context or in a primary context, four learning areas, that'd be 2,000 hours. Now, clearly that is not possible for an individual teacher to do, and they're not able to do that. And I think we see that in terms of the quality of materials that teachers are able to pull together, and also in terms of teachers' sanity. So teachers are saying again and again that they're struggling with workload. We've seen a radical reduction in investment in professional development around curriculum planning. If you speak to some of the older generation of teachers, they'll tell you they used to, work closely with professional associations. There were a number of, rich opportunities to develop their skills, and that's not there anymore. And I think, there's something in this idea that, there is an expectation that teachers will be hyper-local and hyper-responsive to their context, which just exacerbates the challenge. So I think it is time for a complete reset in this space. Schools do need to be doing that whole school planning together as a group. There's a real opportunity there to reduce workload and lift the quality of planning. And I think there's a role for government in providing access to high-quality resources that schools can use if they choose to do so. So we know that some schools, a lot of out-of-field teachers, a lot of beginning teachers, a lot of temporary contract teachers, small schools teachers teaching a lot of subjects that just face some really significant challenges to designing those high quality curriculum materials in-house, and they can be supported through access to external materials. Now, the Liberals have put this on the agenda with their policy, which is great to see. I do think there's appetite in Labor to also consider this, and we're excited to see hopefully some movement on this going forward. But I think it absolutely needs to be one of the top issues after the election.
Fantastic, and thank you for raising open plan classrooms. My daughter's in one of those new school buildings without walls, and I feel just so overwhelmed every time I walk in. I don't know how they do it. Brendan, housing is another perennial in elections, I feel, and I talked about cost of living before. We're hearing a lot about rising costs of rent, challenges in rental availability. How are those challenges playing out in Victoria, and what, if any, policies are on the table?
Thanks, Danny. So the housing challenge in Australia, in Victoria, is very similar to the rest of Australia, in the sense that home ownership is falling pretty sharply. It's falling sharpest amongst younger, poorer households. You're seeing rental stresses remaining high in Victoria as it is elsewhere. So a lot of Australians are struggling to pay to keep a roof over their heads, and homelessness is on the rise. I think what's interesting, though, is since the pandemic, we've actually seen some of those challenges get worse, in the sense that, rents, market rents, advertised rents in Melbourne are up 10% over the course of the last year. They're up 8% in regional Victoria. Vacancy rates are at record lows, which you probably wouldn't expect 2 years into a pandemic where we shut our borders. But what's really going on there is the fact that while the borders were closed, and that meant that roughly 200,000 fewer households didn't come to Australia that would demand housing, so that's each household, you can think of it as needing a home, that's been offset by the fact that we've decided that we want more space ourselves. So fewer people are living in share houses, fewer people are living, with their parents, more people have moved out in order to have space for a home office to be able to work from home. What's interesting is those trends appear, at least in some of the statistics, to be persisting. So, we've actually seen an increase in the number of households domestically of about 140,000. So basically all those homes that were being built that you'd expect that migrants would be in are instead, being occupied by Australians. And those trends are persisting such that now we've got vacancy rates at record lows, we've got rental increases, being pretty rapid. Now, of course, advertised rents is not the same thing as the rents that everyone who's already in a rental property are paying, but it is a pretty good indicator of where things are going. And so those rapid rent rises that we're seeing across Melbourne and regional Victoria, you'd expect them to feed through over time into the rents being paid by Victorians. And in fact, in the inflation numbers, rent is actually starting to become a bigger contributor to why inflation is staying high going forward. So that's the sort of challenge we face. As far as what the parties, and I should mention as well actually that because migration is returning because the borders are open, then those pressures are going to probably get tighter in the next 2 years. So Treasury estimates 470,000, Australia's resident population will rise by 470,000 people because of net overseas migration. Something close to half of those people have historically come to Victoria and to Melbourne. So that's the backdrop where rents are rising quickly. What we've seen from the parties is interesting. The government, so the Andrews government, hasn't put that much on the table in the election campaign around housing. It did a reasonable amount of the course of the last term of government. So they did the big housing build in response to the COVID pandemic, where they spent $5.3 billion building social housing dwellings. That was certainly needed. Social housing stock here in Victoria is the lowest in the country and hadn't increased very substantially for a decade. They've done things like improve tenancy laws, so if people are renting for longer, they're renting with families, it's harder to kick out the tenant from that property, which allows greater rental security. That's a good thing. Also, things about making your house your home, such as being able to keep pets. So that's an improvement, but there are questions about how well that's been enforced. The big policy they were going to take to the election but didn't was the idea of a levy on social and affordable housing, which was basically a levy to pay for social and affordable housing by basically taxing developers, taxing the development process to the tune of 1.75% of the total value of developments where the development had at least 3 dwellings. That would have raised $800 million a year, $8 billion over a decade. That's a lot of money in a state context to put towards social and affordable housing. That's something that they walk back from in the face of opposition from the development industry. And so they probably don't have as much on the table at the moment than they otherwise perhaps would have. The coalition, they focused on stamp duty concessions, so they're going to basically temporarily increase the concessions for stamp duty. Currently, you don't pay stamp duty on a home above under $600,000, and you get a concession under $750,000. They're extending it to homes up to $1 million, but just for the 1 year. And then the question is whether they will extend that budget circumstances arising. But given what we've heard so far, that might be pretty hard to do. They've also actually committed to expand the number of greenfield homes now to accelerate the planning process. Now, that's a hard one to judge, because if we got more greenfield homes, given how hard we make it to build more housing in the inner and middle ring suburbs of Melbourne, that probably would ease affordability somewhat. Is it the right distribution of where you want people to live? It's harder to probably pay for infrastructure on the urban fringe than it is to do brownfield infill, but that would help. And part of what the Victorian government was going to do alongside the levy for social and affordable housing is they were going to relax some constraints on the planning system. The Andrews government walked that back when they said they weren't going to do the levy, even though their press releases had said it would deliver massive benefits to Victorians, not just to the development industry. And so I think that's unfortunate that that's been taken off the table, but Matthew Guy and the opposition have pledged to do that one as well. So you've got some things happening. They probably fall in the category of some having some meaningful impact on housing affordability, making rents cheaper, but we're not seeing enormous changes that you'd probably want to see if you're going to see housing become substantially cheaper in Victoria in the years ahead.
So talking about enormous changes, the Commonwealth budget this year, the big sort of reveal on the night was this idea of a national housing accord. The promise was, I won't call it a promise, it was an aspirational target, was for 1 million homes over 5 years nationally. It was very scant on detail, but one of the elements that was there was the Commonwealth would work with the states to deliver on this accord. What would that look like in an ideal world, in your mind?
Yeah, and what role would Victoria play in that? So, look, that's a federal government announcement. It was in the budget, dominated coverage. 1 million homes is what the Australia normally produces in a 5-year period, and what it produced in a 5-year period leading into the pandemic. So that number, I think, is a distraction. But what could it do? Well, we think a lot of the problems here, where if you want more housing to be built in Melbourne, as in the other major cities, then a lot of the constraints are in the planning system, allowing more housing to be built in inner and middle ring suburbs than is currently. So the way you would do that is the Commonwealth government should be paying the states to essentially push them to make what are otherwise politically difficult reforms to the planning system, because planning tends to reflect the interests of the councils and the people that live in them already. Those that would move to areas if more housing would be built don't get a vote. And so, you'd be Commonwealth pushing the states to build more housing. What we'd like to see out of that process for Victoria would be, the state government setting housing targets for local councils, like what's happening in Sydney, pushing for those councils to take responsibility for their share of the population growth that's going to come down the pipe. Because unless we get that, we end up with, less affordable housing. And I think you can look to the example of Auckland in New Zealand as a great example of where this has happened, where they now have a single level of statewide or citywide government in Auckland since 2010. In 2016, they did an upzoning where they basically improved or raised the amount of housing that could be built on 75% of sites. That was in 2016. 5 years later, there was a study that just came out from Yale that suggested that that's boosted the housing stock of Auckland by 5% compared to where it otherwise would have been, the normal trend. And interestingly, rents in Auckland are lower now than they were in 2016, whereas the rents across New Zealand are up over 10%. And the rents in Wellington, which is probably your most comparable city, are up by 15%. So, if we actually did this kind of reform, we actually allowed more housing to be built, I think we're seeing growing evidence that would actually have the effects that we'd want it to have.
All right, we're all moving to Auckland. Fantastic. We are now going to open it up to questions from the audience. We do have some roving mics down here at the front. Who in the audience would like a question? We've got the lady back there.
Hello, my question is on transport, and it's on what I see as the suburban rail loop conundrum that Marianne Terrell referred to, and the opposition to, well, I won't say opposition to it necessarily by Infrastructure Australia, but Infrastructure Victoria, reservations in terms of the high cost and so on. And then on the other hand, we have We have Ros Hanson and John Stanley recently released their report, being critical of development in the outer suburbs and saying you really need to have that development in the middle areas, and the highlight that the inner areas have had something. I forget the figure, a third of all of the increase, and that's Yarra, Melbourne, and Port Phillip. And why? Because you've got good public transport, access to jobs, transport services and education, and transport that is 24 hours. And the conundrum then is, if you're going to expand your middle suburbs, you need good access to transport. Now, the only really good access to transport in the middle suburbs is in and out of Melbourne, but not across town. So if you're going to expand the population in those areas as been argued for, how are you going to get it unless you reduce the disadvantage of living in those suburbs, being able to go across town? So I ask you about that conundrum, and the Libs haven't actually proposed the loop, the suburban loop. What they've talked about is not going ahead, and they've actually talked about buses or some other mechanism. So the issue is how do you deliver the suburban loop across town in a way that's affordable and not excessive? And it makes sense if you do it by for example, you could even take it all the way to Greensboro, because you could use the northeast link with electric buses in the tunnel area, and you could go all the way to Greensboro, and then you can really build it much more cheaply. Or the other alternative is light rail, medium capacity transit, which was presented by Rail Futures Institute and then picked up as a heavy rail underground. Anyway, so look, this conundrum, I'll ask you to comment on that, given your role in transport, and I'm happy to discuss it with you another time as well.
So what I love about this question is that you're starting with what problem you're trying to solve. So there is a problem with public transport connectivity in the outer suburbs of Melbourne and other in sort of sub areas. I think what I'd say about suburban rail loop is it's 20 years away or 30, depending on which schedule it goes on, and it is a solution that in lots of ways is a very rigid solution, whereas I think you're talking about a nearer term solution and perhaps a more flexible one. So I do see, so it's not to say, I guess you wouldn't want to be thinking, well, if you have a problem with public transport connection, that suburban rail loop is the only option. I think the reason why we have a radial system and why that's a very common system is because heavy rail is good for moving large numbers of people from small numbers of origins to small numbers of destinations. So the CBD does make sense in that environment, whereas smaller suburbs around the town, they do need a connection. But if you run heavy rail, it's just not going to be very feasible to run trains very often. So that's kind of the trade-off that you face. But I would have thought nearer term solutions for people who don't have good connection would be just sort of more practical, certainly more affordable, and it doesn't preclude the things that we're seeing, for example, with COVID, we are seeing changing patterns of work and travel. This is a time of very high uncertainty, so putting a generation's worth of infrastructure investment into this particular project doesn't seem like a prudent approach to me.
Sorry, we need to make some time for other questions. I'm sure Marion will chat afterwards. The gentleman at the front. No, there's right at the back, there is one.
If you look across the total basket of policies for both major parties, would there be much difference in terms of the generational equity impact?
Right, I'm just trying to think that through. It's an interesting question. So I think a lot of the big spend is in transport infrastructure. So if I'm thinking about the kind of the major commitments that are in that 28 billion and the 10 billion, so they're transport, hospital infrastructure, school infrastructure is a lot of what's going on there. I don't think either side have any revenue or tax policies that they're taking to the election. So it's not jumping out to me that there's a big generational difference. I suppose the commitment to invest in greater renewable energy sort of has some degree a generational difference. It's forward looking in terms of dealing with climate, but it's not particularly stark as it has been in, we've talked about a lot here, for example, when we're at federal elections and we're talking about tax policy or housing policy, they have a more obvious kind of generational angle. So I don't think that's probably a big theme for this particular campaign. Yes, one in the middle there.
Thank you. I think my question's mainly for Tony. Obviously, Victoria is quite an industry-heavy state in terms of bread, poultry, dairy. What you were talking about before in terms of climate action and the delays in climate action, obviously there's government pressure, ESG pressure, shareholder advocacy. Do you think we're kind of missing, the thousands of workers that work in those industries and kind of bringing them along on that journey? Just really interested in your thoughts on that.
I think when you look at the sort of roles, jobs that are in carbon-intensive industries we have today, and the most significant one in Victoria would be the coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley. There are some other concentrations, but they're nothing like as dramatic as that. A lot of the jobs that would exist in the sort of things we were talking about, and I'm not talking about building renewable energy projects, they tend to employ quite a lot of people in the construction phase, but you go to a wind farm or a solar farm and you don't see many people. You probably see a few sheep and cattle, but that's about it. So the question then is, well, what are you going to do about how that's going to work out in a way that makes it long-term sustainable economic sense? And that many of the jobs are actually, skills are quite transferable. So a lot of jobs in sort of, for example, steel manufacturing are similar in the trades as would be apply in coal-fired power stations and even in coal mining. So one of the issues here is how do you then help people make that transition? Now, the numbers tend to be, and this is around the world, is that when you go through this sort of processes, and Germany's seeing the same thing, that roughly a third of people, when you go these sort of major transitions, will never work again. Except at their age, they're not going to retrain, they've had enough, they're out. About a third will be re-employed in that area and some of the things that I've been talking about, and that's where I think the really interesting opportunity is, because there's going to be significant numbers of jobs potential, although finding people right now, as you would know, any tradesman is actually very difficult to do. And then the other third, people who leave and go get some jobs somewhere else. And that tends to be what's happened now. That doesn't mean that the regions themselves go into decay, because what then tends to happen is, as people start to think about the new things that can happen in these places, then Newcastle is probably one of the greatest examples now, because it's a long time ago since the BHP closed down its steel factories there. We saw a very strong commitment, both from the government, state government, local communities, the unions, education system, and BHP to help make this transition. So I think in those cases, in the broader sense, there are some really interesting opportunities, but they won't come about just simply by wishing. You've actually got, and this is why I think something like the Latrobe Valley Authority, which the Labor government did put in place when the Hazelwood power station shut down, is a fantastic example of how to do this. Doesn't cost very much, but skilled people who know what they're talking about on the ground, working with the local communities, that's where the answer's going to be. Now, we are seeing some signs of a bit of that, even in agriculture, for example, at a federal level. Helen Haynes was very successful in getting something through to provide on-farm advice to farmers about how they can improve the sustainability of their farming practices. So that's one that's happening now. I've not seen much about that issue in Victoria yet, because most of the emphasis, I think, has been on electricity generation and what has to happen there, and not really about the transition, except for we're going to create a lot of jobs building wind farms. And that's good, but I don't think it's what we're really looking for in the longer term.
All right, we've got time for one more. You are lucky last. Please keep it short and sweet.
I'll try. Yes, my question is just about the major parties and coming up to this next election, whether either of them have stipulated any changes to cultural policy agendas for the state, and I guess on the back end of that, thinking about the Commonwealth Games in 2026, and that this government in the last sort of year of their term will have to deal with that as well.
I don't know if I'm going to have an answer for you, I'm sorry. There are so many policies floating around. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of them. Have any of you guys seen anything on cultural policy in the mix?
The one I could note was the Liberals do have a music education policy for schools. So $50 million for musical instruments, a pipeline of music teachers into schools, and sample lesson plans for music education. So actually that was, I thought that was quite nice, actually, I'll say. So they've got an eye to the future there.
Well, that's a nice note to finish on, perhaps. Thank you, and sorry we didn't have a more comprehensive answer to your question. I always wonder how politicians do that, manage to be, across every detail of what's going on. It's a very impressive skill. But hopefully you've at least had a real sense of some of the big issues as they are playing out in this campaign. If you do value rigorous, hopefully high quality research and policy discussion, please do consider supporting Grattan. We rely on donations from our wonderful supporters to continue doing what we do, and you can always jump on the Grattan website at grattan.edu.au in order to do that. Please also consider joining us for what will be our final live event of the year. It is on 8th of December, and we will be revealing our annual reading list, proposed reading list, summer reading list for the Prime Minister. So if you are looking for some books that are very topical, that are very readable, that are very policy relevant for your own summer beach bags, come along and get some suggestions. It's always a very fun discussion. I'll be joined in talking about the books with journalist Eleanor Hill, and we are also going to have a number of the authors of the books actually join us on stage as well. So it will be a very enjoyable discussion. Again, you can find out more on the Grattan website. Thank you to my wonderful panellists. As always, plenty of interesting and meaty things to say. And thank you as well to Grattan staff members and to Bea, who made everything run smoothly. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Happy election, happy voting, and hopefully see you all back here on the 8th of December. Good night.